The alarm did not wake Eugenia Whitmore. She had not needed an alarm in 40 years, and she did not need one now at 92. Her body had its own clock set to the hour before dawn, set to the particular darkness that preceded the first gray suggestion of light over the Blue Ridge in November, set to the cold that gathered in the corners of the cabin in the hours when the wood stove had burned down to nothing and the mountain air pressed against the walls with the patient insistence of something that had all the time in the world. She lay still for a moment after waking as she always did, not from exhaustion, from discipline. Every morning began the same way. Before she asked her body to function, she took inventory of it, the same inventory conducted in the same order, with the same clinical attention that she had brought to everything she cared about for the better part of 9 decades. Left knee first. Stiff this morning, the familiar protest of cartilage that had been negotiating its terms for 30 years, but not screaming. Not the kind of stiff that meant today would be host before it began. That counted as good. She filed it and moved on. Right hip. The deep ache was there, as it was every morning, as it had been every morning for the past decade, the ache that would ease after she had been moving for an hour and would return in the late afternoon, and would never, she had long since accepted, entirely leave. She had made a kind of peace with the hip. She did not ask it to be other than what it was. She simply worked around it the way you work around a stone in a field you have been cultivating for decades. Hands. She raised them slowly in the dark and flexed her fingers one at a time, feeling the familiar resistance of joints swollen with arthritis. The knuckles enlarged and stiffened into what her daughter Noelle had once called, with the particular discomfort of a person trying to be kind, while saying something true, gnarled. Like tree roots, Noelle had said. Eugenia had looked at her hands and thought, tree roots are strong. Tree roots hold the earth. She had said nothing to Noelle. The hands could work today. They had worked yesterday and the day before, and the day before that, through pain that would have been a reasonable excuse to stop if she had been a person who accepted reasonable excuses. She was not. Back right side. The old compression fracture, 1987, making its presence known the way it always did in cold weather. A low, constant reminder. She breathed through it. It would improve when she was upright. She did the full accounting. She always did the full accounting. At 92, the difference between a fall and a day's work was not dramatic. It was a matter of attention, of knowing exactly what your body was doing and what it was likely to do, of not asking it to perform agility you hadn't verified it possessed. A fall at 92 meant hospitals and hospitals, meant concerned faces leaning over her bed, and concerned faces meant exactly the scenario her children were trying to force through the courts. Evidence that she couldn't manage alone. Proof that someone needed to take control. She would not fall. She had not fallen in 11 years, and the streak would continue today. She pushed herself upright slowly with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly what was at stake in every movement, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment in the dark while the room oriented itself around her. The cabin was cold. She could feel it in the air against her face and arms, the specific cold of a mountain morning in November. The cold that had texture to it that pushed through fabric and settled into joints with a thoroughness that polite cold did not manage. She reached for Walter's robe. It hung on the hook beside the bed where he had always left it. Where he had left it in September of 2004, on the night before he went to the hospital for what was supposed to be a routine procedure. Where she had left it after unable to move it, and then unable to want to move it, and then simply incorporating its presence into the structure of her mornings, the way you incorporate any truth you have decided to live with rather than fight. 20 years. The robe had been on that hook for 20 years. She wrapped herself in it and stood. It was still a little too large. He had been broader than her, through the shoulders a carpenter's breadth, the accumulated effect of decades of physical work building things that were meant to last. The extra fabric fell around her in a way that was not exactly warmth, not exactly comfort, but something between the two that she had never found a word for and had stopped trying to name. She made her way to the wood stove. Building a fire was meditative work. It had been meditative work for 43 years in this cabin, and she moved through it with the ease of something so long practiced that it had passed beyond skill into instinct. Crumpled the newspaper. She still had the weekly paper delivered, still drove into town every Tuesday to collect it. Still sat at the kitchen table on Tuesday evenings reading every page, including the classifieds and the agricultural reports and the letters to the editor, because staying connected to the world required active effort, and she had always done the work that required doing. Arrange the kindling so the air can move through it. Strike a match. The kindling caught with the dry, crackling sound she had loved since childhood, the sound of cold being answered, the sound of warmth beginning its work. She watched the flame take hold and spread, and then added 2 pieces of split oak, not the largest pieces, but not the smallest, calibrated to the morning's cold, by the same instinctive arithmetic she brought to everything that required calibration. The stove door closed with its familiar metallic click. She went to make coffee. The percolator had been on the stove in this kitchen since 1975. Walter had found it at a farm sale on a Saturday morning in October, and she could still see him holding it up over the table of goods, with the expression he wore when he found a small treasure. Eyebrows raised, that private smile that he reserved for things that met a standard he couldn't always articulate, but always recognized. He had turned it over in his hands, examined the mechanism, found the seam sound and the glass dome intact, and the whole apparatus constructed with the seriousness of a time when things were built to last rather than to be replaced. Eugenia, he had said, "This is a quality machine. This will outlast us both." He had not been wrong. The percolator was in daily use 49 years later, functioning with the steady reliability of something that had been made correctly and maintained with attention. Walter was 20 years gone. The percolator was here. She measured the grounds with the measuring spoon that lived on the shelf to the left of the stove, added water, set it on the burner, and stood at the window while she waited. Outside, the November morning was asserting itself in the slow way of mountain. November mornings, the darkness not lifting so much as thinning the black of the tree line against the sky, distinguishing itself from the black of the sky by gradations too subtle to specify but clear enough to read if you had been reading this particular landscape for decades. She knew this view. She knew it in all its seasons and all its weathers, knew the way the light moved across the garden beds in winter, and the way the frost settled in the low places first, and the way the creek at the bottom of the property sounded different in November than it sounded in June. The garden beds were sleeping under their frost and straw mulch. Rectangular shapes in the half-dark that looked simple from here, looked like any kitchen garden, put to bed for winter. She knew differently. She knew every inch of what was below that mulch, which bed held, which variety, where the soil ran deep and where it thinned toward rock, which sections drained well, and which required attention in a wet spring. She knew it the way you know something you have worked with your hands for half a century, not only in the mind but in the body, in the particular understanding that lives below language. The percolator began to move, the sound of coffee working its way through the grounds, the familiar smell of it filling the kitchen. She poured a cup and stood with it at the window and thought about the day that was coming. Adrian Pruitt had scheduled the visit for 9 o'clock. Eugenia had received the paperwork 3 weeks ago. She had read it once carefully all the way through in the way she read everything. Not skimming, not looking for conclusions first, but working through the document in order, understanding each section before moving to the next. The language was the careful language of institutions that had developed vocabularies for things they needed to do that sounded less severe in institutional language than they would have sounded in plain speech. Evaluate, assess, determine, review. What the paperwork meant in plain speech was this: her children had filed a petition for guardianship in Watauga County Superior Court, and the county's Adult Protective Services had been tasked with sending someone to her home to establish whether she was capable of making her own decisions and managing her own property. Whether she was at 92 still in possession of herself. She set down her coffee mug on the kitchen counter with slightly more force than she intended. The thought of it produced in her a feeling she had been managing carefully for 3 weeks, a feeling she did not allow herself to indulge fully because indulging it would not help her, and she needed to be clear-headed for what was coming. Not anger exactly, though anger was part of it. Something with more precision than anger. The specific cold clarity that arrives when someone you trusted makes a choice that reveals they never quite understood what they were asking you to trust. Eugenia went to the small desk in the corner of the main room and took a notebook from the drawer. Not a new notebook. An old one, its cover worn soft, its pages filled with the careful handwriting she had been developing since she was 7 years old, precise and small, the handwriting of someone who had always understood that the things you put on paper were worth putting on paper correctly. She had been keeping this particular notebook for 20 years. She had started it 6 months after Walter died, and she had not started it from suspicion or from any dark premonition about what her children would eventually do. She had started it because Walter's death had left her alone in a way she had not been since she was 19 years old. And the loneliness had a specific texture to it, and one of the ways that texture expressed itself was in the way she waited for the phone to ring. Her children called. They called regularly. Garrett once a month, sometimes more. Noel once a month, usually. Cody less often, for which he apologized in the careful, sheepish way of a youngest child who had always been better at feeling guilty than at changing the behavior that produced the guilt. She wrote down the dates and the duration of the calls, not because she was building a case. She wrote them down because writing them down was the closest she could get to the feeling that these calls were being counted, were being received, were adding up to something, rather than simply passing through her days without accumulation. Garrett, she had noted, averaged 4 minutes per month. The calls were practical mostly. He reported on things happening in his life, his work, his house, a vacation he was planning. He asked the same 3 questions in the same order. How are you feeling? Is the cabin warm enough? Do you need anything? She answered the same 3 questions in the same order. The calls were not unloving. They were simply brief. Noel, average 6 minutes, more variable. Noel sometimes called when she was troubled about something unrelated to Eugenia, and those calls ran longer because she needed to talk, and Eugenia was the person she had always talked to when she needed it. Eugenia did not mind. She stored those calls differently from the others in the notebook, not just dates and durations, but brief notes. N called troubled about something with the grandchildren. Wouldn't say what exactly. Talked for 14 minutes. That was last spring. She had never found out what it was about. Cody, the fewest entries, the shortest durations. She did not judge him for it. He was the child who had inherited the most of her own self-sufficiency, the capacity to go long stretches without requiring connection, and to assume that others were similarly capable. It was not a wrong assumption. It was simply not always the most accurate one. Then September, 6 weeks ago. In September, a developer had called her. A man named something she had not retained his name, had not wanted to retain it, who had obtained her number through means she did not ask about, and had explained with the practiced enthusiasm of his profession that his company was prepared to offer $850,000 for her 40 acres and the cabin and any structures on the property, that the land had development potential, that the offer was, he believed, she would find generous. She had told him she was not interested and ended the call. The following week, all 3 children had called, Garrett twice, Noel 3 times, Cody once, but at length. The calls were different from the usual calls. The questions were different. More thorough. How are you really feeling? Have you been to the doctor recently? Have you thought about what happens if something goes wrong when you're up there alone? Are you sleeping well? Is the cabin warm enough in winter? There were references to options, to facilities, to the peace of mind that came from knowing someone was there. Eugenia had answered the questions. She had noted the timing in her notebook, the same notebook she now held in her hands in the early morning of the day of Adrian Pruitt's visit, the week after the developer's call. All 3 children suddenly, urgently, deeply concerned about her welfare. She was not a woman who assumed the worst about people she had raised and loved, but she was also not a woman who looked at a coincidence of this specificity and called it coincidence. She had spent 57 years in careful observation, recording what she saw, with accuracy drawing conclusions from evidence rather than from what she wished were true. The evidence was the notebook in her hands. She put it in her coat pocket where it would stay for the rest of the day. She went to the back room. The door to the cedar room was the same door it had always been, a plain interior door fitted with a standard knob. Nothing to announce the space behind it. She opened it and stepped inside and breathed. The room was small. James had built the original shelves in 1970, spending an entire weekend measuring and leveling and starting over when he determined that the first attempt was not quite right. She had sat in the doorway that weekend, watching him work, drinking coffee, offering the occasional observation that he received with a distracted nod and filed or ignored according to his own judgment. He had been talking to himself in the low voice he used when he was solving a problem, an almost inaudible running commentary that she had learned over years to interpret as the sound of a mind working rather than the sound of a mind-wanting company. These shelves need to hold 100 years of work, he had said at one point. Not to her exactly, more to the uncooperative board he was trying to get level. They need to be built right. They had been built right. 54 years later, not one shelf sagged. The wood had darkened with age, but remained solid, the joints still tight, the whole structure as sound as the day he had stood back and looked at it with the expression of a man who had accomplished something to his own standard. The shelves now held 2,347 glass jars. Each one was sealed, labeled in her handwriting, and arranged according to a system she had developed over decades and refined as the collection grew. The labels were white paper rectangles, the writing small and precise, each one containing the variety name, the year she and Walter had first acquired or grown the variety, and the generation number, the count of how many times they had grown the variety, from seed selected the finest specimens, harvested the seeds, and started again. Each generation was a year's work, a season's attention, a specific investment of the particular patience that seed saving required. Cherokee Purple Tomato, 1972. James's grandfather, generation 15. She had grown this tomato 15 times from seeds since 1972. In the rotation system she and Walter had developed together over the years, a system that ensured no variety went too long without a growing season, and no growing season was overloaded with varieties requiring the same conditions. 15 generations. Each one descended from the one before, adapted slightly to the specific conditions of this soil and this climate, carrying within it the cumulative genetic history of 15 seasons in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The seeds in this jar were not simply Cherokee Purple Tomato. They were Cherokee Purple Tomato as it had been shaped by the specific experience of growing in this place with this soil through these winters and these droughts and these particular patterns of cold and heat. They were, in a sense, she had come to understand with increasing clarity over the decades, becoming more themselves with every generation. Moon and Stars. Watermelon, 1969. Generation 18. She had acquired this variety in the second year of the collection from a vendor at a farm market in Wilkes County who had grown it his entire life and whose own parents had grown it before him. By 1985, the variety had disappeared from commercial seed catalogs. The seed companies had stopped offering it. If you had gone looking for Moon and Stars watermelon in any catalog in 1986, you would not have found it. It was, as far as the commercial seed industry was concerned, gone. It was not gone. It was here in a glass jar on a shelf in a room in the Blue Ridge Mountains, generation 18. Hopi Blue Corn, 1978. Generation 12. She and Walter had received this variety from an elder in northern Arizona on a summer trip they had taken with the express purpose of meeting people who were doing work similar to theirs. The elder had been an older man, small and precise in his movements, with the particular quality of stillness that seemed to belong to people who had spent long lives paying careful attention. He had pressed the seed envelope into Walter's hands with both of his own, and he had looked at Walter with a directness that asked for nothing less than complete seriousness in return. "Keep these going," he had said. "Our young people aren't planting them anymore. We're losing them too fast." Walter had driven home largely in silence that day. She had watched the desert give way to mountain and mountain give way to the familiar landscape of the East, and had understood that the drive was not a time for conversation. That evening, sitting at the same kitchen table with the seed envelope between them, Walter had looked at her and said something she had been thinking about for 36 years since. "I think we've been underestimating what we're doing here." He had been right. They had been underestimating it. What they were doing was not a collection, not in the sense of accumulation for its own sake. What they were doing was a kind of custody, a responsibility accepted from people who could not carry it forward themselves in trust for people who did not yet exist. The seeds in these jars were not objects. They were living things temporarily in stasis, carrying within them genetic information that in some cases existed nowhere else on Earth. She moved along the shelves slowly, reading labels she had read 10,000 times, her fingers trailing the cool glass of jars she had filled season by season. Jacob's Cattle Bean, 1969. Generation 14. Mortgage Lifter Tomato, 1971. Generation 13. the generation that had almost not happened. She paused at the mortgage lifter. The jar held seeds that traced their lineage directly back to a Virginia farmer in the 1930s who had crossed 4 varieties of tomato over 6 years, perfecting his cross through seasons of patient selection, and had sold enough plants from the resulting variety to pay off his mortgage during the Depression. Hence the name, a story encoded in a name. The farmer's ingenuity, his patience, his specific problems solved by the accumulated intelligence of a plant guided by human attention. She and Walter had received the seeds in 1971 from an elderly man at a market in Grayson County who had pressed them into Walter's hands with the particular solemnity of a person transferring something they understood to be irreplaceable. "Charlie's gone," the man had said. "I'm the last one growing these." He was not the last one growing them. For 53 years, Eugenia Whitmore had been growing them. In 1989, a blight had swept through the garden with the speed and thoroughness of a catastrophe that announces itself only after it has already done its damage. She had walked out one August morning to find plants destroyed across 3 of her beds: the Cherokee purples, the Brandywines, the mortgage lifter. Brown and blackened collapsed the damage overnight, the work of spores that had moved through the warm, wet air of a humid August and found everything they needed. 3 mortgage lifter plants had survived. 3 out of 11. They were in the corner bed farthest from the drainage issue that had made the rest vulnerable, and they had survived not by any virtue of their own position, but by the specific accident of geography, the kind of accident that was indistinguishable from luck, unless you had spent years arranging your beds so that accidents of geography would be possible. Walter had built makeshift covers from old window frames and sheets of plastic, and he had erected them over the 3 surviving plants with the focused efficiency of someone doing what needed doing without wasting time on what couldn't be helped. He had checked the plants twice a day, morning and evening, for 2 weeks, crouching in the low space under the plastic with a flashlight in the evenings after dinner, speaking to them in the low voice he used for things he was worried about. She had watched from the garden path and understood that what she was watching was a man who took his responsibilities seriously down to the level of his cells. The fruits had ripened. They were smaller than usual, the plants having put their energy into survival rather than production, but they had ripened. Walter had harvested the seeds with the same care he brought to everything and had come to dinner that evening with the expression of a man who had resolved something difficult. "Still here," he had said. That was all. Still here. She had known he wasn't only talking about the tomatoes. Eugenia stood in the seed room in the early morning of the day that would determine whether she was allowed to remain in possession of this place and this work, and she let herself fully feel what was at stake. Not the financial value of the property, though. $850,000 was a number she was capable of understanding. Not even the cabin itself, though. The cabin was the place where Walter had been most completely himself, and where she had been most completely herself, and where the particular combination of their 2 selves had produced the work that now filled these shelves. What was at stake was the continuation of 57 years of custody held in trust for people she would never meet. If her children prevailed, if Adrienne Pruitt found what they hoped she would find, if Judge Carolyn Brent looked at a 92-year-old woman and decided that the number itself was sufficient evidence of incapacity, then Garrett and Noel and Cody would sell this property to the developer who had called in September, and the cabin that Walter built in 2 summers in the 1960s would be demolished, and the seed room and its shelves would be cleared, and the jars would go somewhere she did not know where exactly. Perhaps a university collection, perhaps a government facility, perhaps nowhere at all, but they would stop being living populations. They would stop being grown out and selected and returned to the jars with the understanding gained from each new season. And varieties that had survived the near miss of 1989 and the drought of 1998 and the unexpected late frost of 2011 would be reduced to data in a frozen archive. Not wrong exactly, preserved after a fashion. But the difference between a frozen archive and a living population was precisely the difference between preserved and alive, and she had understood the importance of that difference for 50 years. She closed the seed room door behind her. The sky outside the kitchen window had lightened to the gray blue of a November morning fully arrived, and she could see the frost on the garden beds clearly now, each mulched row distinct in the low slanted light. She poured a second cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and opened the small notebook from her coat pocket. 20 years of entries. each one dated in the upper right corner, each one recording the date and duration of a phone call from one of her three children. She did not read through them this morning. She had read them many times. She simply held the notebook in her hands and thought about September, about the week after the developer's call, about the sudden flooding of calls from people who had averaged 4 minutes per month for 20 years. She was not going to perform false forgiveness for the benefit of a social worker. She was also not going to perform bitterness. She was going to say what was true as precisely as she could say it, and she was going to let the truth do what truth did when it was placed in front of people with the capacity to see it. She trusted Adrienne Pruitt to have that capacity. She was not certain, but she trusted it enough to proceed on the assumption that she did. The knock came at 8:40, 20 minutes early. Eugenia noted this without surprise. People who arrived early to evaluations were people who were already composing their notes in their heads, people who wanted the advantage of finding you unprepared. She did not hurry. Hurrying was dangerous, and she would not be dangerous today of all days. She walked to the door at the pace she always walked, steady and deliberate, and opened it. The woman on the porch was in her mid-50s, practically dressed for the cold with a clipboard under her arm, and the kind of face that had been trained into professional neutrality but had not yet fully extinguished the emotional life underneath it. She had kind eyes. Eugenia had learned over 9 decades not to be too moved by kind eyes. Kind eyes were not the same as clear sight. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Adrienne Pruitt, Adult Protective Services. I apologize for being early. Come in, I've made coffee. Eugenia stepped aside and watched Adrienne enter the cabin, doing what trained evaluators did on entering a space, taking inventory, running the room, against an internal checklist, measuring what they saw against an idea they had formed before they arrived. She watched Adrienne's eyes move. She tried to see what Adrienne saw. The cabin was a single large room plus the bedroom behind the partial wall and the seed room beyond that. The main room was small by the standard of the houses her children lived in. The houses built in the decades since comfort had come to mean scale. Small, but sufficient. The wood stove was warm, its iron sides radiating a heat that reached every corner of the room. The kitchen along the south wall had a sink with running water from the well, a counter of scrubbed wood shelves bearing labeled canning jars and dry goods, in the careful order of someone who knew exactly what they had and where to find it. The table by the east window had 2 chairs and caught the morning light. There was a reading chair near the stove with a lamp beside it and a stack of books on the small table next to it. She had been reading Thomas Fleischner's essays on natural history and a monograph on legume genetics from NC State, and a mystery novel that Noelle had sent her in October with a note saying she thought Eugenia would like the main character because she was stubborn and right about everything. Everything was clean. Everything was organized. Nothing was disordered in the way that disorder announces itself to people who are looking for it, the disorder of someone who has stopped being able to manage the details of a daily life. You've lived here alone for 20 years, Adrienne asked, accepting the offered coffee and sitting at the table. She had her clipboard out, but held loosely, not in the active note-taking position. Since my husband passed, Eugenia confirmed, sitting across from her. Since 2004. Adrienne made a note. The hesitation before the note was small but present. She was looking at the room instead of at her clipboard, which suggested she was revising something. Your children have initiated guardianship proceedings, Adrienne said. They're concerned about your welfare, about your safety living alone. She paused on the word, or paused before it at your age. My children want $850,000 from the sale of this property, Eugenia said. She was proud that her voice stayed level, that the fury that had been living in her chest for 3 weeks did not find its way into her words. They're using my age as a legal mechanism to obtain control of assets I own. I'd like to be direct about what this actually is. Adrienne's pen paused. She looked up from the clipboard. You believe this is financially motivated. I know it is. Eugenia took the small notebook from her coat pocket and set it on the table between them. This is 20 years of phone call records. My 3 children combined. Dates, durations. 4 minutes average for Garrett, 6 for Noelle, fewer for Cody. She paused. The week after a developer made an offer on this property, all 3 of them called within 7 days. Calls that averaged 3 times their usual length. All of them suddenly and urgently concerned about whether I was managing adequately. Adrienne looked at the notebook. She looked at Eugenia. The professional neutrality in her face was doing something more complicated then maintaining itself. That she began. I have the developer's call in my records too, Eugenia said. September 17th, his name and number and the amount he offered. The following week, 3 children, 5 calls. She sat back. I'm not asking you to take my word for the timing. I'm showing you the documentation. The room was quiet for a moment. Adrian was looking at the notebook with the expression of someone encountering a fact that did not fit the framework they had brought with them. Would you show me the rest of your living situation? She said. I'll show you everything Eugenia said, but first there's something you should see. Something that will help you understand what my days actually consist of. She led Adrian to the back of the cabin. She did not explain what was behind the door. She simply opened it. Adrienne Pruitt stepped into the seed room and stopped. Eugenia watched her face. She had imagined this moment in the weeks since she received the guardianship paperwork, had tried to prepare herself for what it would feel like to have a stranger's eyes on 57 years of work. She had expected something complicated. What she had not expected was what she saw in Adrienne's face, which was the specific expression of someone whose category system has just encountered something it doesn't contain. The clipboard came down to her side. 2,347 glass jars floor to ceiling, in the perfect order of a system that had been refined over decades. Each one labeled each label in the same careful handwriting, each generation number a small record of time and attention, in the particular discipline of a person who had understood from the beginning that the work required exactness, and had brought exactness to it every single season for 57 years. Adrienne moved into the room slowly reading labels. Her head moved from jar to jar, with the focus of someone trying to take in information faster than their processing speed allowed. What is this, she asked. The question was genuine. Not a form question, not the question of someone moving through a checklist. The question of someone who had arrived expecting to find one thing and had found something entirely different and needed to understand what they were standing in front of. Eugenia came to stand beside her. This is 57 years of work, she said. Hers and Walter's, together, and then hers alone, and somehow both at once, because work begun together doesn't stop being shared simply because one of the partners is gone. She moved to the shelves, touching labels as she spoke. My husband James and I began collecting and preserving heirloom and heritage seed varieties in 1968. After he died, I continued. This collection represents 2,347 distinct varieties of vegetables, herbs, fruits, and grains. Many of them are commercially extinct. They exist, if they exist at all, anywhere in the world in collections like this one. She paused. I grow out each variety on a rotation schedule. I select seeds from the finest specimens each season. I return them to these jars. The generation numbers on the labels tell you how many times each variety has been grown and selected since we began. These are not preserved specimens. These are living populations with genetic histories that no frozen archive can replicate. Adrienne stood in the middle of the room, holding her clipboard against her side, and looked at the shelves with an expression that was no longer professional and no longer neutral. She was looking at the jars the way you looked at something that was requiring you to revise an understanding you had not realized you were holding, Mrs. Whitmore, she said finally. Her voice had shifted. Something had left it, and something else had taken its place. I need to make some phone calls before I complete my assessment. She paused. What you've shown me here, she looked at the shelves again, then back at Eugenia. This is considerably more than I was led to believe. Eugenia nodded once. Precisely. After Adrienne left, Eugenia stood alone in the seed room for a long time. The morning light had shifted while they talked, moving past the single small window in a way that caught the glass jars at an angle and made them glow faintly, the seeds inside casting tiny shadows on their curved glass walls. She had always loved the light in this room at this hour. Walter had positioned the window himself, calculating the angle of winter sun on a morning in October when the framing was going up, and she had watched him stand in the unfinished room and look at where the light fell and adjust his plan. She should have been relieved. Adrienne Pruitt's expression at the end of the visit, the way she had said, what you've shown me here, the quality of recalibration visible in her face, all of it suggested the visit had gone, and as well as it could have gone, better than she had allowed herself to hope. But Eugenia stood in her seed room and let herself feel what she had not permitted during the evaluation itself because she could not afford it then and was alone now and could afford it briefly. Fear. Not the surface fear of falling or getting sick, the practical fears of a life lived at 92 in a mountain cabin. Something older and deeper than those. The fear that even if she proved herself today, even if Adrienne Torres wrote the most positive possible report, even if every expert on earth confirmed that what she was doing here was work worth doing and a mind worth preserving, it still might not be enough. Because the law had mechanisms for this. Because guardianship petitions existed precisely because society had decided at some point that age was a legitimate category for overriding a person's choices about their own life. Because a judge could look at a 92-year-old woman living alone in a mountain cabin and decide, regardless of the evidence, that someone else needed to be making her decisions. And if that happened, everything in these jars went still. Everything Walter had built, everything the elder in Arizona had pressed into Walter's hands and asked them to keep going, everything the man in Grayson County had entrusted to them, with the hope that they were people who would understand the weight of what they were receiving, all of it would stop. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. Seeds lose viability if they are not grown. A population not maintained becomes a record, and a record is not the same as a life. She sat down on the wooden stool Walter had made in 1974, on the lathe he had bought himself for his birthday, a second-hand machine he had spent a summer learning to use, and that had produced over the following decades more furniture than she had ever expected a lathe to produce, several pieces of which were still in daily use in this cabin. She sat because standing suddenly felt like more than her body wanted to manage. She was 92 years old. She was tired. She was frightened in the specific way of someone who has something irreplaceable to protect and is not entirely certain that the structures meant to provide protection will recognize what they're protecting. She let herself feel it completely the way she always let herself feel the things that needed to be felt, not indulging it past the point of usefulness, not suppressing it past the point of honesty, but sitting with it in the middle space where truth had room to be itself. It was not fear of dying. She had been making peace with dying for 20 years in the slow, incremental way of someone who takes mortality seriously without letting it become the organizing principle of their days. It was fear of this ending before its time, of the work stopping short of what it was capable of becoming, of the seeds remaining in their jars, ungrown, slowly losing what they had carried across decades of careful custody. She closed her eyes and sat in the room Walter had built for the work they had begun together, and she let herself feel the full weight of what she was fighting for. Then she opened her eyes. She stood up. She went to check the wood stove, which needed another piece of oak, and she added it and adjusted the damper and stood in the warm kitchen, watching the frost begin to lift from the garden beds outside as the morning gathered its light. And she thought about tomorrow and the day after that and all the seasons still possible if she prevailed. The stove ticked. The percolator sat on the back burner, cold now, waiting for afternoon. The seed room door was closed. The call came on a Thursday morning, 48 hours after Adrienne Pruitt's visit. Eugenia was in the seed room working through the documentation update she had been putting off for 3 weeks, while the guardianship proceedings had occupied the portion of her attention that would otherwise have gone to the notebooks. She had 53 volumes of records, each one containing the full history of every variety she had grown. In a given year, the germination rates, the growing conditions, the selection criteria she had applied when choosing which specimens to harvest, seeds from the observations she had made about how each variety was changing across generations, the small signs of adaptation that accumulated slowly enough to be invisible season to season and clearly visible when you compared the entries from a decade apart. The most recent volume was open on the workbench, and she was writing notes from the previous seasons, growing in the careful small handwriting she had developed over decades of filling notebooks that needed to hold a great deal of information without wasting the space that running out of pages represented. She was writing about the Cherokee purple tomatoes, the 15th generation, and what she had observed in their disease resistance compared to the 12th generation when the satellite phone on the shelf above the workbench rang. She picked it up. Dr. Fletcher Odom introduced himself, NC State University Department of Plant Genetics. He had received photographs from a county social worker. He said this with the careful neutrality of a scientist who wanted to convey information without editorial comment about the circumstances in which the photographs had been taken, and he had looked at them for the better part of 48 hours, and he would very much appreciate the opportunity to visit her collection in person if she was willing. His voice had a quality she recognized immediately, though she had not heard it directed at anything of hers in 20 years. It was the voice Walter used when he found a rare variety at a market, or received seeds from a correspondent he hadn't heard from in months, or opened a letter from someone across the country who was doing similar work. The barely contained quality of a mind that had encountered something it had been looking for without knowing it was looking for it. The specific timbre of genuine excitement disciplined into professional language. She had not heard that voice directed at her work since Walter, something in her chest, something she had been holding tight for 3 weeks without fully naming what she was holding released. Not because Fletcher Odom was going to save her. She did not think in those terms. She had not needed saving in 92 years, and she did not intend to begin the habit now. But because the voice was the voice of someone who had looked at the photographs and seen what was actually there, and after 3 weeks of managing the experience of being assessed by people who could not see what was actually there, the voice of someone who could see it was for a moment more than she had been expecting. She told him he could come the following day. He arrived at 8 in the morning with a graduate student named Theo, who carried a notebook and said almost nothing for 6 hours and filled the notebook completely. Dr. Odom was in his early 60s, compact with the efficiently organized quality of a scientist who had been moving quickly between too many projects for too long and had learned to carry everything he needed without unnecessary weight. He shook her hand with the direct grip of someone accustomed to working with their hands as well as their mind, and he looked at her with the complete attention of a person who had come here for a specific purpose and intended to accomplish it. She let him in. This was not a tour. She was not showing him around the way a person shows a visitor around a space they are proud of, pointing out features and waiting for approval. She was walking him through a working system, explaining its logic, giving him the information he would need to understand what he was looking at. The organizational structure, first not alphabetical by common name, which would have been easier to explain to someone unfamiliar with the collection, but organized by family, and then genus, which was the organization that made practical sense when you were managing a rotation schedule for over 2,000 varieties and needed to know which plants needed what growing conditions and which could not be planted in close proximity to which others. He asked questions at each stage, good questions, the questions of someone who was building a real understanding rather than collecting data points to file away. She answered completely without simplification because she had spent 57 years working at a level of precision that simplification would misrepresent, and she was not willing to misrepresent the work for the convenience of a listener who turned out in any case not to need simplification. The notebooks were where they spent the most time. She pulled the first volume from the shelf. 1968, the beginning. The handwriting young and confident, and rounded the entries detailed, with the thoroughness of someone who understood from the first season that this was the kind of work that required documentation, but who had not yet developed the shorthand of experience that allowed her to say in 10 words what the early volume said in 30. She opened it to the first entry. Brandywine tomato acquired spring. 1968 planted, April 14th. Germination began April 22nd. Notes on soil preparation, notes on growing conditions, notes on the specific characteristics of the plants she had selected for seed saving and her reasons for selecting them. Then she pulled the most recent volume, the same variety, the 17th generation, the handwriting smaller and slower but no less precise. The entries no less thorough, more thorough in some respects, because 5 decades of observation had refined her understanding of what was worth noting and what a future reader would need to know. She set the 2 volumes side by side on the workbench. Theo stopped writing and looked at them. Odom was quiet for a long moment. This is 53 volumes of continuous documentation, she said. Every variety, every season, every growing cycle, from 1968 to last year. She moved to the shelf that held the full run of notebooks, 53 volumes in a row, the spines labeled by year in her handwriting. When I began, I didn't know how long I'd be doing this. She paused. Then I began to understand what it was, and I kept the records more carefully because I understood that the records were part of the value. Odom ran his index finger along the spines of the notebooks without touching them. The gesture was almost involuntary, the gesture of a man reaching towards something he understood to be significant. They went to the outdoor gardens. November had put the beds to sleep, the growing season long finished, the soil under its mulch of straw waiting for spring. But a sleeping garden was not an empty garden, not to a person who knew how to read it. She walked Odom through each bed, naming what was beneath the mulch, explaining the rotation that had brought each variety to this particular bed in this particular season and would move it somewhere else in the next. She showed him the windbreaks she had planted over decades, the rows of shrubs and small trees placed at the angles that the prevailing winds required. Rather than the angles that looked symmetrical, the functional arrangement of someone who had been watching how weather moved through this specific landscape for 40 years. She explained the isolation distances she maintained between varieties that were susceptible to cross-pollination. She showed him the hand pollination records from the previous summer mornings spent in the garden with a small brush moving pollen from flower to flower with the focus and delicacy of work that was both scientifically necessary and she had always found quietly beautiful. The individual attention that each variety required the specific knowledge of which plants needed it and when accumulated across years of growing each one. Odom listened. He took notes in his own notebook, rapid and illegible, in the way of scientists whose note-taking was for their own use rather than anyone else's. He asked his questions. She answered them. They went back inside in the early afternoon. She made tea and brought out the ginger cookies she had baked that morning because she had always baked when she was managing something difficult, had learned this about herself sometime in her 40s, and the baking had helped in the way that simple physical tasks helped when the larger task was not something your hands could directly address. They sat at the kitchen table, the three of them, and Fletcher Odom set down his tea and looked at her with the direct, careful expression of a scientist who was about to say something he had spent the morning building toward and wanted to say with precision. Eugenia, he said. He had moved to her first name at some point in the middle of the morning with a naturalness that suggested it had happened because the distance that last names maintained had become over the course of the day an inaccuracy. What you have preserved here is extraordinary. He said it without the inflation that extraordinary usually carried when people used it casually. He said it as a precise description. I don't use that word imprecisely. She waited. From what I've seen today, you have at minimum 187 varieties that are commercially extinct, not available from any seed company, not listed in active cultivation in any registry I'm aware of. He set down his cup. The documentation represents decades of observational data that does not exist anywhere else. Data on how these varieties perform across generations, how they adapt to specific conditions, what environmental pressures affect their expression over time. That data is not replicable. If it is lost, it is lost. He looked at her steadily. But there's something else I need to say to you directly because I think you need to hear it from someone outside your immediate situation. She waited. What you have been doing here for 57 years is professional-level scientific work. He said it simply without rhetorical emphasis, the way you said a thing that you intended to be received as fact rather than compliment. The absence of institutional support, of a title of funding, of anyone paying attention, those absences do not diminish what this is. In some respects, they make it more remarkable because you did it without the infrastructure that makes this kind of sustained, systematic work possible in institutional settings. You built the infrastructure yourself. She looked at him. She had known the value of the work for decades. She had known it with the private certainty of someone who did not need external confirmation to understand what they were doing. But she had carried that knowing alone since Walter in the way that you carry things when there is no one beside you to carry the other end, the specific weight of importance that no one else could see. Having it said back to her by someone who had arrived as a stranger and spent a day looking at the evidence and arrived at the same place she had been standing for 50 years, it produced something she had not expected. Not relief exactly, more like the specific feeling of weight that has been carried alone for a long time being briefly and genuinely shared. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, I need the documentation to be thorough enough that no one who looks at it can call this an old woman's hobby. She said it without bitterness, as a specification. My case goes before a judge next month. I need what you've seen today to be on record in a form that the court cannot minimize. Odom nodded. I was going to suggest exactly that. There was one more thing. She had been saving it not deliberately, not as a tactical decision, but because she was still processing what it meant, and she was not a person who spoke about things she was still processing. But this was the moment, and Fletcher Odom was the right person, and she went to the shelf and took down the jar she had been thinking about since his phone call 2 days ago. She carried it to the table and set it down between them. Mortgage Lifter Tomato, 1971, Generation 13. Odom looked at the whim. He looked at the label. He looked at the generation number. He picked up the carefully holding it at eye level, the way she often held the jars when she was thinking about the seasons they represented, and he read the label a second time. Then he set it down and looked at her with an expression she recognized because she had seen it in Walter's face once, in the year after the elder in Arizona had pressed the corn seeds into his hands when the understanding of what they were holding had fully arrived. "You're aware that the USDA declared this variety extinct," he said. "In 2019, yes." He was quiet for a moment. USDA's Plant Genetic Resources Program spent $340,000 in a 5-year search for living populations. They found frozen samples in 2 locations. No living populations. She looked at the jar. 13 generations, she said. The first time we nearly lost it was 1989. She told him about the blight, about the 3 surviving plants, about Walter's 2 weeks of twice-daily checks under makeshift covers, speaking to them in the voice he used for things he was worried about. Odom was listening in the way of a man who understood that what he was hearing was not a personal story but a scientific record. "He saved it," she said. "We saved it. And every season since it has been grown here and selected and returned to this jar." She looked at the label. Generation 13, each one building on the last. Odom set his notebook on the table and looked at her across it. "Eugenia," he said, "this jar does not just represent a living population of a variety the USDA has been searching for. It represents 13 generations of adaptive selection in this specific environment. The genetic diversity in those seeds and the adaptation history is entirely distinct from the frozen samples in government archives. This is not a duplicate. This is irreplaceable." She had known this. She had known it in the way she knew everything about her collection from the inside, from 50 years of doing the work, from the specific understanding that came from attention rather than analysis. But hearing it said in the language of plant genetics by a scientist from NC State who had spent 6 hours looking at the evidence and arrived at the same conclusion, she felt something move in her chest. "Walter," she thought, "you were right. We were underestimating it." Odom left in the late afternoon with Theo in his completely filled notebook and a set of photographs, and the promise that he would have a formal assessment completed within 2 weeks. He shook her hand at the door with both of his, which she took to mean something more than the handshake she had received in the morning, and he told her that he would be in contact about bringing colleagues about additional documentation about what needed to be on record before the hearing. She thanked him without elaboration. She was not a person who elaborated on gratitude. After his car had disappeared down the drive, she stood at the kitchen window for a long time. 3 days later, Constance Belair arrived from Colorado. She had flown in at Odom's recommendation, which Eugenia understood as the professional network doing what professional networks did when something of genuine importance needed to move quickly. Constance Belair was the regional director of the USDA's Plant Genetic Resources Program, and she arrived with the manner of someone accustomed to making consequential decisions quickly in the eyes of someone who had spent a career looking at preserved genetic material and understood the difference between good and extraordinary. She spent most of the day in the seed room. She did not need the tour that Eugenia had given Odom. She moved through the shelves with the specific directional purpose of an expert who was checking her own conclusions against the evidence, pausing at the jars she had already identified from Odom's photographs as significant reading generation numbers, with the focused attention of someone to whom generation numbers were a specific kind of information, rather than a curiosity. When she found the mortgage lifter, she stood in front of it for 2 full minutes without speaking. That evening they sat at the kitchen table, and Constance Belair made an offer with the directness that Eugenia appreciated in a person, the directness of someone who respected the time of the person they were addressing. The USDA wanted to hire her as a consultant, $75,000 per year, a formal contract to document the collection, advise on preservation methodology, and contribute her decades of observational data to the National Plant Genetic Resources Database. $75,000 a year. The number was significant. The number was practically speaking the thing that would make the property financially secure regardless of what her children attempted through the courts. It was income, documented income from the federal government, which was a thing a judge evaluating a guardianship petition would have a difficult time setting aside. Constance Belair waited for her response with the patience of a person who had delivered significant offers before and understood that significant offers required a moment. Eugenia sat with the offer for that moment. Then she said, "I'll need to think about it overnight." Constance's expression did not change, but something in her stillness suggested this was not the response she had expected. "I'll let you know tomorrow morning," Eugenia said. "I don't make decisions about my work the same day they're proposed." Constance left. Eugenia sat alone at the kitchen table as the November dark gathered outside the windows, and the wood stove settled into its evening rhythm, and she thought about the offer. She thought about it not as a financial instrument, which it certainly was, but as what it actually represented. Consultant. The word had a specific meaning in the language of institutions. It meant expert. It meant that the knowledge she possessed, the knowledge built from 57 years of daily work, from the specific education of sustained attention to a living system across the better part of a century, was worth paying for. Worth paying for at a number that recognized it as professional expertise rather than as the charming eccentricity of an elderly woman who had spent her retirement in a garden. She was not a problem to be managed. She was a resource. She sat with that for a while. She thought about Walter, who had understood what they were doing here before she did, who had said, "We've been underestimating this in the kitchen" one night after a summer drive across the country, and who had spent the following 20 years bringing everything he had to the work with the specific commitment of a man who had understood its value and was not going to let that understanding be theoretical. She thought about what it would have meant to him to hear the word consultant applied to what they had built together in this room. She went to bed. In the morning, she called Constance Belair's number. "I'll accept the offer," she said, "on the condition that the documentation happens around the work, not instead of it. I have varieties that need to be grown out next season. Spring planning begins in December. This collection stays active. Bureaucracy schedules itself around the growing season." There was a brief pause on the line. "I wouldn't have it any other way," Constance said. The following week, Garrett's attorney filed supplementary documentation with the court. 3 instances, the filing alleged, in which Eugenia Whitmore had failed to respond to contact attempts in the preceding 6 months, suggesting a pattern of communicative withdrawal consistent with early cognitive decline. She read the filing at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning there with Stuart Henley, her attorney, who had driven up from Boone and who had the specific quality of stillness that good attorneys develop, the ability to receive bad news without performing a reaction to it that would be more about their own discomfort than the situation at hand. She read it twice. Then she set it down and went to the shelf where she kept the communication log. The first missed call was in July. She had been in the South Garden at the time, in the middle of hand-pollinating the squash varieties, a task that required both hands and her full attention, and that she had been in the middle of when the phone rang in the cabin 40 feet away. She had gone in after finishing the row she was working and found the missed call and called back within the hour and had a 4-minute conversation with Garrett about nothing in particular. The second was in September, a Sunday afternoon, the anniversary of Walter's death. She had been sitting in the seed room with the door closed and the phone on the shelf above the workbench, and when it had rung, she had looked at the screen and seen Garrett's name and set the phone back on the shelf. She had not been ready to talk to anyone that afternoon, and she was not required to be, and there was nothing in any law or social contract that obligated a 92-year-old widow to take a phone call on the anniversary of her husband's death from a son who called for 4 minutes once a month. The third was a technical failure. The satellite service had experienced an outage across a 3-county area for 8 hours in October. She had documentation of the outage from the provider's notification email, which she had printed and filed when she received it, because she had learned over decades that the things you could not have known would matter were often the things you had not bothered to document. She set the communication log on the table in front of Stuart Henley. "Garrett knows all 3 of those reasons," she said. "He called back each time within 2 days and spoke with me. He asked how I was. He knows what happened in September and why I didn't answer. He filed this anyway." Stuart Henley read through the log. His expression was the expression of a lawyer who had been in practice long enough to have seen this kind of thing before and had not become resigned to it, which she took as a sign of his continued investment in the importance of what he did. This is a pressure tactic, he said. It's not strong enough to change the outcome of the hearing, but it's designed to generate paperwork and create the impression of a pattern where no pattern exists. I know what it is, Eugenia said. She said it without heat. I know what all of this is. What I need to know is what we do about it. They did several things. Stewart filed a response that addressed each instance specifically with the documentation she had. The provider's outage report for October, her call log showing the return call after the July incident, and for September, not documentation but a brief and accurate statement of fact. Mrs. Whitmore did not answer the phone on September 14th because it was the 20th anniversary of her husband's death. She returned the call on September 15th. He also subpoenaed the phone records for the 6-week period following the developer's September offer. The records confirmed what her own log had recorded: a significant increase in contact attempts from all 3 children in the weeks immediately following the date of the developer's call. It would be before the judge. The night of the 21st of December, Eugenia woke at 3 in the morning and knew without deliberation that she was not going back to sleep. She put on Walter's robe and her wool socks, and she took her coffee cup from the kitchen and filled it from the thermos she had prepared before bed, and she went to the seed room. She did not turn on the overhead light. She had a small lamp on the workbench that she used for close work, and she turned that on, and the room filled with the specific quality of lamplight among glass jars. The warm glow scattered and multiplied and returned from every angle in the way that makes a room full of glass feel inhabited by light in a manner that a room full of other surfaces does not. She walked along the shelves slowly. She was not afraid exactly. Fear had been present in her over the past weeks in the way that weather is present, something she moved through, something she was aware of and had accommodated into the functioning of her days without letting it become the climate. What she felt tonight was something different, something more considered. The specific state of a person who is prepared as thoroughly as preparation allows and is now waiting for the outcome of something that is no longer entirely in their hands. She touched jars as she walked. The glass was cool under her fingertips, the familiar weight of each jar's contents, something she could estimate by touch after so many years of handling them. Brandywine tomato, 1968, generation 17. The first variety they had grown intentionally to save seeds from. Walter had bought the seeds at a farm supply store because he liked the name, which was exactly the kind of decision Walter made, not impulsive, not arbitrary, but guided by the specific instinct of a man who paid attention to things that other people walked past. They had grown the tomatoes that first summer, and Walter had eaten one standing in the garden before they were fully off the vine and had turned to her with juice running down his chin and said with the complete conviction of a man who had just tasted something that exceeded expectation, "We have to save seeds from these. Future generations need these." He had been 31 years old. He had been right. 17 generations of Brandywine tomato grown in the rotation schedule. She maintained each generation a season's work, each season a link in a chain that went back to that afternoon in the garden in 1968, when a man with juice on his chin had made a decision that turned out to matter more than either of them understood at the time. She kept walking. Kentucky Wonderpole bean, 1969, generation 17. Walter's mother's beans, the beans of his Tennessee childhood summers, found through a family connection in the second year of the collection and grown faithfully ever since. She could still taste them, the specific sweet green snap of a pod she had been eating for 55 years. The beans in this jar were not simply Kentucky Wonder Pole beans. They were, in some sense, she had never found fully adequate language for, still his mother's beans, still carrying the genetic memory of summers in eastern Tennessee, shaped now by 55 more seasons, but continuous with the original. A thread running backward through time. Purple Hull peas, 1975, generation 14. Traded at a farmer's market in Wilkesboro for Cherokee purple tomatoes with a woman named Alma, who had stood at her table and admired the tomatoes and said she had something to offer in return. They had exchanged seeds and phone numbers and begun a correspondence that had run for 28 years until Alma died in 2003. Each jar from that trade was a relationship, a thread connecting to a specific afternoon and a specific person and a specific act of trust between strangers who recognized that they were doing similar work in different places. She sat down on Walter's stool and looked at the shelves from the low angle of the lamplight and let herself feel the full weight of what she might lose tomorrow. She did not resist it. Resistance would have been a form of dishonesty with herself, and she had not been dishonest with herself in 92 years, and she was not going to begin tonight. She let it be as large as it was. The farm, the cabin Walter had built with his own hands across 2 summers in the early 1960s, the building that still held in its joints and its proportions, the specific intelligence of the man who had made it. The seed room with its shelves that had not sagged in 54 years. The jars and their contents, the living populations, the genetic histories, the 53 volumes of notebooks. The work that was both hers and Walter's, simultaneously the work that did not stop being shared just because one of the partners had been gone for 20 years. She sat with the full weight of it. She sat until the weight had been fully received, fully acknowledged, until there was nothing more to feel that she hadn't already felt. Then she straightened up. She was not done yet. Tomorrow was not yet over because it had not yet begun, and she was not going to spend the hours before it in something other than readiness. She was still sitting with the lamp in the pause when she heard footsteps on the porch. It was past 11 at night. She had been in the seed room for nearly 2 hours. She heard the footsteps, and then she heard the particular hesitation before a knock that tells you the person on the other side of the door is not certain they have the right to knock. She went to the door and opened it. Noelle stood on the porch in the December cold, wearing a coat she had not zipped, her hair not arranged, her eyes red in the way of eyes that had been crying recently and had not fully finished. She had driven 4 hours from Charlotte without calling ahead. She was standing in the cold outside her mother's door at 11:30 at night with her coat unzipped and her hands shoved in her pockets, in the specific expression of a person who had done something they cannot undo and has not yet found the language to address it. Eugenia stepped back from the door without speaking. Noelle came inside. She stood in the main room for a moment, not sitting, not speaking, looking around the cabin with the specific attention of someone who was seeing something with fresh eyes and was processing the difference between what they were seeing and what they had expected to see, or what they had imagined, or what they had told themselves. Then Noelle moved toward the seed room. Eugenia said nothing. She simply followed and turned on the overhead light. Noelle stood in the seed room for a long time. She read labels. She looked at generation numbers. She moved slowly along the shelves in the way that everyone moves slowly along these shelves when they were really looking, because the scale of the thing required slow movement to take in accurately. Her eyes moved across the jars with an attention that Eugenia had not seen in her daughter's face in this room before, because Noelle had been in this room before years ago briefly on visits when the collection was still being built, and had not looked at it this way. She had not looked at it at all. Finally, Noelle turned to face her. "I didn't know," she said. Her voice was quiet and had the flat quality of genuine understanding arriving rather than being performed. "I didn't know this was all of this." Eugenia looked at her daughter, 63 years old. The daughter she had raised, who had her father's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness and her own specific quality of feeling things deeply and expressing them poorly, a quality that had caused misunderstandings throughout her life that she had usually resolved eventually through the sheer persistence of her love for the people she had hurt. "Now you know," Eugenia said. They stood in the seed room together for a while. Not reconciled, that was not what, this was not yet, not on a single evening. But the silence between them had a different quality from the silence that had been between them for the past 3 months. It was the silence of two people in the same room with the same truth in front of them, which was a different kind of silence from the silence that accumulates when people are occupying different versions of a story. Noelle sat down on the wooden stool. She looked at the shelves. Eugenia went to the kitchen and made tea, and she brought 2 cups back to the seed room, and she sat on the low bench along the wall that Walter had built for sitting in this room on exactly this kind of occasion, and they drank tea together in the lamplight among the jars. After a while, Noelle said, "I'm sorry for what we tried to do." The words came out halting and incomplete, the words of someone who knew they were inadequate and was saying them anyway because they were better than nothing, and nothing was not an option she could live with. Eugenia looked at her daughter. "Now you know," she said again, not as dismissal, as the only complete response available. Because the knowing was the thing that mattered, not the apology, which was a social form, a ritual acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. The knowing was the change in the actual understanding that Noelle now carried, the understanding that would make whatever came next different from what had come before. Noelle stayed until midnight. They did not speak much more. There was not much more to say tonight. Tomorrow there was a court hearing, and the hearing would say what it would say, and everything after that would depend on what it said. But when Noelle left, she hugged her mother in the doorway for longer than she had hugged her in years, and Eugenia stood in the hug and felt the particular weight of a daughter who was trying to come back from somewhere she should not have gone, and she held on because holding on was what she had always done when the things she loved were in danger. Noelle's car disappeared down the drive. Eugenia stood on the porch in the December cold and looked at the sky, which was clear and full of stars. In the way that mountain sky in December is full of stars, the Milky Way visible as a broad, faint band above the ridgeline, the familiar stars of winter in their familiar positions. She went inside. She built the fire up and made sure the water pipes were protected for the cold night ahead, and checked that she had everything she needed for the morning. Her clothes were laid out on the chair, a simple dark dress, Walter's wool coat, her good boots. In the morning, she would put them on and look in the bathroom mirror and see herself as she was, and she would go to the courthouse in Boone, and she would say what needed to be said. She was 92 years old. She was tired in the deep way of someone who had been fighting for a long time against a thing that should not have required fighting. She was also clear. Clear in the way she was always clear when the preparation was complete and the thing itself was about to begin, the clarity that came from having done everything that could be done and being ready to find out if it was enough. She went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind against the cabin's walls. The wind her husband had built those walls to answer, and she felt the cabin hold. To do. She woke at 5:30 without the alarm as she always did. The inventory first. Left knee stiff but functional. Right hip the familiar deep ache that would ease after movement. Hands the arthritis present and accounted for. Back the compression fracture, making its December declaration. She could work with all of it. She had worked with worse on days that mattered less than this one. She lay still for one additional moment, not from habit this time, but from intention. She had learned over 9 decades of mornings the difference between a moment of stillness taken from fear and a moment of stillness taken from readiness. This was the second kind, the kind that came from having done everything that preparation allowed and arriving at the threshold of the thing itself with nothing left to second guess. She pushed herself upright and reached for Walter's robe. The fire first, the coffee, the percolator working through its ritual while the cabin warmed. She stood at the kitchen window with her cup and looked out at the December morning, which was the particular gray of a morning that had not yet decided what it intended to be. The garden beds were visible under their mulch, the familiar shapes of a year's work put to rest, waiting for spring to ask something of them again. Spring, she thought. She was going to be here for spring. She said it to herself the way she said everything she needed to be true, not as a wish, not as a prayer, but as a fact she was stating in advance of the evidence, the way a farmer stated the expectations for a season, while understanding that the season would ultimately say what it had to say regardless. She was going to be here for spring, and she was going to plan the rotation in December, as she always did, and she was going to put the Cherokee purple tomato seeds in their starting trays in March under the grow lights she had set up in the east corner of the seed room, and she was going to do it as the 16th generation rather than the 15th, because the 15th had been last year, and time moved in one direction. She set down her cup and went to dress. The clothes she had laid out the night before were waiting on the chair. A simple dark dress, the one she wore for occasions that required acknowledging their own importance without making a performance of it. Walter's wool coat, which she had been wearing to important occasions since 2004, not as sentiment exactly, but as the simple fact that it was the warmest coat in the cabin and the best made, and the one she reached for when she needed something that would hold up to what the day required. Her good boots polished the previous afternoon. She dressed with the deliberate care of someone who understood that how you prepared for something communicated something about how seriously you took it. And she took this seriously, had been taking it seriously for 10 weeks, and she was not going to let the morning of the thing itself be careless, when the preceding 10 weeks had not been. In the small bathroom mirror, she looked at herself, 92 years old, white hair pinned back in the way she had worn it for 40 years, the style that had stopped being a fashion decision sometime in her 60s and had simply become the way her hair was arranged, a settled fact, like the way the cabin sat on the hillside or the way the seed room smelled in winter. Dark eyes still sharp, the sharpness of eyes that had been looking carefully at things for 9 decades and had not lost the habit. The face of someone who had been outside in all weathers for most of her life, weathered in the way that was different from worn the way that stone is different from something that has simply been used up. "This is who I am," she said to the mirror. Not aloud. It was not the kind of statement that required sound. "This is who I am going to the courthouse to defend." She went to get Walter's coat from the hook. The drive down the mountain took 40 minutes in December, the road winding through the kind of landscape that was austere and beautiful in exactly equal measure. At this time of year, the bare trees showing the structure. They spent the warmer months concealing the ridgelines, clear against the gray sky, the whole country laid out with the honest simplicity of something that had removed all its decorations. She drove the way she drove everything, with attention. Stuart Henley met her in the parking lot of the Watauga County Courthouse, with the composed readiness of a man who had prepared as thoroughly as she had and arrived knowing that preparation was over and execution had begun. He was in his 50s, compact with the quality of stillness that good lawyers developed over years of managing their own reactions in rooms where other people's reactions were running high. She had found him through a recommendation 3 months ago and had made her assessment of him in the first meeting in the first 20 minutes, in the way she had always made assessments of people by watching what they did with what they were told rather than what they said they would do with it. He had done what he said he would do. They went inside. The courthouse was warm from its radiators, working against December, the particular institutional warmth of a public building on a cold day, the warmth of a space that held its temperature by duty rather than by design. Eugenia registered it without particular feeling. She had been in buildings like this before, in the different capacities that a life of 9 decades accumulated as a witness, as a plaintiff in a property dispute decades ago, as a voter, as a person conducting business with the county government. Institutions had their specific atmosphere, and she moved through it without being altered by it. She and Stuart Henley took their seats at the table on the left side of the courtroom. Garrett was already there at the table on the right with the attorney whose name Eugenia had been given in the initial paperwork and whom she had thought of since only as the opposing attorney because she found it clarified her thinking to keep the categories clean. Garrett was sitting with the jaw-set stillness he had worn since boyhood when he had decided he was right about something and was bracing for the argument. She had known that face for 60 years. She had loved it when he was 6 years old, and she had measured it accurately, and she measured it now. He did not look at her. Noelle was at the same table to Garrett's right, her eyes showing the evidence of a night that had not provided much sleep. She looked at Eugenia when Eugenia took her seat. A look that lasted longer than the previous months of looks had lasted, a look that contained the specific quality of someone carrying something they had not been carrying before. Eugenia received the look and returned it and said nothing because there was nothing to say here that was not already said or would be said. Cody was to Noelle's right, the youngest of her 3 children, the one who had always occupied the middle distance of every family situation present, aware and not quite committing to either shore. He looked at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who had arrived at a situation he did not fully endorse and did not know how to exit. In the gallery, she noted without turning to look directly Fletcher Odom in the 3rd row with his notebook on his knee. Adrienne Pruitt, composed and professionally prepared. Constance Belair, who had flown back from Colorado, which said something about what she considered worth the trip. A woman she recognized from the photograph accompanying the byline of the article in the Raleigh News and Observer that had run 3 weeks ago and had traveled far beyond Raleigh, had traveled far enough that she had received in the weeks since emails forwarded by Stuart Henley from people in 13 states who had read it and found in it something they recognized. Judge Carolyn Brent entered, and the room stood, and she sat, and the room sat, and the proceeding began. The opposing attorney presented the case for guardianship with the competent, methodical thoroughness of a person doing their professional best with the material they had. She was not a bad attorney. The argument she was making was not on its surface unreasonable, which was part of what had made the past 10 weeks difficult. The argument was not unreasonable in the way that all arguments for guardianship were not unreasonable in the abstract when the subject was 92 years old and living alone in a mountain cabin. The argument became unreasonable only when you placed it against the specific facts of this specific person, and the opposing attorney's task was to prevent the specific facts from outweighing the general argument. 92 years old, remote location, no proximate family, physical limitations, documented instances of non-response to contact, a lifestyle that in the opposing attorney's framing posed inherent safety risks that could only be responsibly addressed through supervised care. Eugenia listened to her life being described in these terms and felt the controlled, focused quality of attention that she brought to everything that needed to be understood completely before it was responded to. She listened for what was accurate in what was being said, because she had always found it more useful to understand the legitimate elements of an opposing position than to treat the whole of it as wrong. There was accuracy in some of it. She was 92. She did live alone. The cabin was remote. These were facts. The inaccuracy was in what the facts were being used to conclude. Garrett testified. He spoke about his concern for his mother's welfare with the particular earnestness of a man who had found the version of his motivations that he could live with, the version in which the financial coincidence was background noise and the foreground was genuine worry. She listened and heard underneath the testimony the truth she had carried in the notebook for 20 years. Not that her children did not love her, but that their love had not been sufficient to produce the presence that love, when fully expressed, usually produced. You could love someone and not show up. You could love someone and choose repeatedly the convenience of distance. Both things could be true simultaneously. She did not require him to be a villain. The truth was more complicated than villains, and she had always preferred the complicated truth to the simple one that left important things out. Noelle testified briefly, her voice holding the careful control of someone managing more than the question required. She said the things she had come prepared to say. Under Stuart Henley's cross-examination, her answers became shorter and her eyes went to the table. Cody said very little. Under cross-examination, the timeline emerged. Stuart Henley asked his questions with the quiet precision of a man who knew exactly where each question led and had arranged them in the order that would take the testimony there most directly. The total accumulated days of in-person visits from all three children in the preceding 2 years, the average duration of monthly phone calls, the date of the developer's contact, the date of the first contact attempt in the week following. The dates were on record. The record was in front of the court. Adrienne Pruitt testified about her November visit. She described the cabin, the organization, the cleanliness, the evidence of a person managing her environment with full competence and intention. She described the seed room, and her description had the quality of genuine observation rather than institutional reporting, because she was describing something that had altered her understanding of what she had come to find, and that alteration was visible in how she spoke about it. She was not describing a collection. She was describing a scientific undertaking of professional scope conducted with professional rigor across more than 5 decades. Fletcher Odom testified about the collection's scientific significance. He testified with the specific authority of a plant geneticist who had spent a day in the presence of something extraordinary and was now explaining to a courtroom what extraordinary actually meant in the context of biodiversity conservation and genetic resource preservation. He explained the distinction between frozen archive storage and living population maintenance, the distinction Eugenia had been living inside for 57 years, and which he now placed in the language that a courtroom could receive. He explained what generation numbers meant. He explained what the documentation in 53 handwritten notebooks represented as a body of scientific data. He testified about the mortgage lifter tomato and the USDA's 5-year search and the $340,000 spent looking for what was living in a glass jar on a shelf in Watauga County, North Carolina. He testified about what would be lost if this population was not maintained. Constance Belair testified about the USDA consulting contract and its terms and the institutional basis for the assessment that had led to the offer. She was brief and precise, and the precision was the testimony because the USDA did not pay $75,000 per year for expertise that did not exist. Through all of it, Eugenia sat at the table on the left side of the courtroom with her hands folded in front of her and her attention fully present and her face doing the things she had always asked it to do in situations that required it, holding its own counsel until the moment came to speak. The moment came after the testimony was complete, and Judge Carolyn Brent looked across the courtroom and said, "Mrs. Whitmore, I'd like to speak with you directly." Eugenia stood. She walked to the witness stand at the pace she always walked, the pace of someone who was not performing agility. She did not have, who did not need the courtroom to believe she was younger than she was, who was not afraid of the evidence of her age because the evidence of her age was not the point. She sat in the chair and folded her hands and looked at the judge. Judge Carolyn Brent was in her early 60s, silver-haired, with the unhurried manner of a person who had heard a great many cases and had arrived at the understanding that cases were people and people required patience. She looked at Eugenia with the specific quality of attention. That genuine curiosity produced the quality of someone who had been given an account of a person and was now in the presence of the actual person and was updating the account. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "why do you choose to live, as you do, alone in a remote location at 92 years old?" Eugenia had prepared for this question. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything thoroughly from multiple angles, anticipating the variations it might take and thinking through the most accurate and complete response she could construct. She had an answer ready. The answer addressed the safety systems she maintained, the emergency communication device, the quarterly welfare checks she had already agreed to accept from neutral parties, the USDA contract, and its implications for the financial security of the property, the documented value of the work, and its continuation. She opened her mouth, and then she stopped. The prepared answer was true. Every element of it was accurate and relevant and would serve her case. But she was sitting in a witness chair in front of a judge who had asked her a genuine question, and the genuine question deserved the deepest true answer she had access to, not the most useful one. She had spent 92 years giving the deepest true answer she had access to because that was what she believed the people she was talking to deserved. And she wasn't going to stop now in the room where it mattered most. She let the prepared answer go. "Your Honor," she said, "I'm 92 years old. I've lived long enough to understand the difference between comfort and meaning. Those two things are not always in conflict, but they are not the same thing, and when they come apart, it matters a great deal which one you choose." She paused. "I could be in a care facility, warm, safe, with people present, with someone to call if I fall. Also slowly emptying out because the thing that makes me get up at 5:30 in the morning, regardless of how much my hands hurt, would be gone. Instead, I'm in the cabin my husband built, continuing the work we started together 57 years ago. That work is the only form of grief that has ever genuinely helped me. Not shrines, not remembering in the way that holds a person in amber and calls it honoring them. Continuing, doing the thing we agreed mattered and continuing to do it, and finding that continuing to do it is the truest thing I know how to say about what he was." She looked at the judge. "My children believe I should prioritize safety over purpose. Safety matters. I know that. I've spent 20 years living carefully and deliberately and attending to the practical realities of a life lived alone at altitude. But I've also watched people who were kept safe surrender their purpose and survive their own deaths by years. I have no interest in that particular form of survival." She paused because the next thing needed to stand on its own. "Taking my choice away from me because I'm 92 is not protection. It is an assumption that the number has made me incompetent. I am not incompetent, I am old, and I am in pain, and I am doing work that an agency of the federal government has determined is worth paying for, and those three things exist simultaneously without contradiction. They are simply the truth of my life. I would ask the court to let them continue to be." Judge Brent looked at her for a long moment. Not the look of a judge managing a proceeding, but the look of a person thinking about something they had been given to think about. "If I deny this petition, Mrs. Whitmore, will you accept reasonable safety measures going forward? I already have an emergency communication system. I accept periodic welfare checks from neutral parties. I accept reasonable precautions." Eugenia looked at the judge directly. "What I do not accept is management by people with documented financial interests in a specific outcome. That's not safety. That's something else." Judge Brent wrote something on the pad before her. She called a recess of 20 minutes. Eugenia returned to her seat. Stuart Henley sat beside her and did not speak because there was nothing useful to say, and he understood this. She folded her hands on the table and looked at the window at the far end of the courtroom, through which a rectangle of December sky was visible, the gray sky of a morning that was still deciding what it intended to become. The 20 minutes were the longest 20 minutes she could remember in recent years. She was aware of them passing with the specific awareness of someone waiting for something that cannot be hurried. The awareness of a gardener waiting for germination, the knowledge that the outcome is not in your hands anymore, that the preparation has been made and the conditions are what they are, and now the thing either happens or it doesn't. She thought about the seed room, about the lamplight among the glass jars the previous night, about the mortgage lifter tomato and the 13 generations it represented, and the afternoon in 1989 when Walter had crouched under a makeshift plastic cover in the August heat and talked to 3 plants in the voice he used for things he was worried about. She thought about the percolator on the stove that Walter had said would outlast them both. Still here. Judge Brent returned. The courtroom stood and sat. The judge looked at her papers for a moment and then looked up at the room with the settled quality of someone who has reached a conclusion and is prepared to deliver it without apology or elaboration. I've reviewed all evidence and testimony presented in this matter. My ruling is as follows. The petition for guardianship is denied in its entirety. A sound moved through the room, not dramatic, the quiet collective adjustment of people absorbing information they had been waiting for. The judge continued, Eugenia Whitmore has demonstrated full cognitive capacity and is living independently by informed and conscious choice. She maintains her property in a manner consistent with competent management. She is engaged in work of documented scientific and cultural significance as established by expert testimony and by the consulting contract with the USD A-Plant Genetic Resources Program. She has established and continues to maintain reasonable emergency safety systems. She looked up from her papers. There is no legal basis for limiting her autonomy. She paused. Furthermore, the court notes that this petition was initiated within a documented period of weeks following the discovery of this property's significant development value, in combination with a documented history of minimal in-person involvement in Mrs. Whitmore's daily life by the petitioning parties prior to that discovery. These facts do not establish the motivation of the petitioners with certainty. They do establish that the timing and circumstances raise questions which the testimony presented has not satisfactorily resolved. She looked at the table on the right side of the courtroom. Quarterly welfare checks will be conducted by Adult Protective Services personnel, as Mrs. Whitmore has already agreed. No future guardianship petition may be filed without substantial documented evidence of actual cognitive incapacity, as distinct from the fact of advanced age. She set down her papers. This case is closed. The room moved. People stood. Voices began. Eugenia sat still for a moment at the table on the left side of the courtroom, the stillness of someone letting something arrive at its full dimension before standing up into it. She felt the release not as a burst, but as a gradual unwinding, the way cold leaves a room when the fire has been burning for enough hours, not all at once, but steadily from every direction, until the absence of the cold is what you notice, rather than any specific moment of warmth. Stuart Henley shook her hand. Fletcher Odom was at her side, his hand on her shoulder. Briefly, the gesture of a man who had not known her long enough to have earned elaborate sentiment and chose the economy of a single clear gesture instead. Constance Belair embraced her, which surprised Eugenia, and then did not because Constance had driven from the airport this morning for this hearing, and that fact said what needed to be said about what she believed was at stake. Adrian Pruitt shook her hand with both of hers. The courtroom was emptying the ordinary movement of people with other things waiting. At the table on the right side of the room, Garrett had already risen. He stood with his back to her, speaking in a low voice to his attorney, his posture, the posture of a man who has lost an argument and is beginning the private process of reorganizing his position. He did not turn. He did not look at her. She watched his back for a moment and felt not bitterness, not satisfaction, but the specific sadness of a parent looking at a child they love who has done something that does not look like love, and understanding both things simultaneously and not being able to resolve the contradiction. Cody looked at her from across the room. A long look, uncertain, containing the specific expression of a youngest child who has followed where his older siblings led and is now processing the distance between where he stands and where he might have chosen to stand if he had chosen for himself. He did not speak. She did not speak. The look lasted long enough to say something without words, and then he looked away and followed Garrett toward the door. Noelle was standing near the exit. She did not leave. She stood near the exit with her coat on and her hands in her pockets, and she waited while the room cleared, and when the room was mostly empty, she walked back to where Eugenia was gathering her things and stood in front of her. "Mom," she said. "Noelle." Noelle looked at her mother with the eyes that were her father's eyes and her own grief in them, and the specific particular effort of a person trying to say something important and finding that the important things resisted the available language. "I know it's not enough," she said finally. "I don't think there's a version of sorry that is enough for this, but I am. I'm sorry for what we tried to do to you." Eugenia looked at her daughter, 63 years old, standing in a courthouse in December with her coat on and her hands in her pockets, trying to find the words for something that the words were going to be inadequate for, and saying them anyway because they were better than the alternative. "Thank you," Eugenia said. It was not forgiveness, not yet, not the complete and uncomplicated forgiveness that would require more time and more evidence and the accumulated proof of changed behavior across a longer stretch than a single courthouse morning. But it was true, and she did not say things she did not mean. She was genuinely grateful. Grateful for the effort, for the willingness to say the inadequate thing, rather than the nothing that was easier, for the fact of Noelle standing here, rather than leaving with her brothers. They walked out of the courthouse together into the December air. Outside it had begun to snow, not the dramatic snow of a storm, but the soft, unhurried snow of a day that had finally decided what it intended to be, the kind of mountain snow that came down with a particular quietness, each flake taking its time, the whole fall of it, less weather than atmosphere, less event than state. Eugenia stood on the courthouse steps and lifted her face to it. She was free. The property was hers. The work could continue. Whatever years remained to her were by the determination of a court of law and the judgment of the evidence her own to live. She thought about the seed room waiting on the mountain, about the Cherokee purple tomatoes in their generation, 15 jar, the seeds that had been grown and selected and returned to glass 15 times and would be grown again in March. About the rotation plan she had not allowed herself to work on for 3 weeks, because the uncertainty of the preceding weeks had made planning feel like an act of hubris. About the specific feeling of pressing seeds into starting mix in the east corner of the seed room. Under the grow lights, the fundamental act, the thing she had done in some form every spring for 57 years, the act that said another season, another continuation. She would do it again in March. The snow came down. Spring came to Hawthorne Ridge with the specific optimism that mountain springs carry the optimism of a season following a hard winter of warmth, returning to ground that had been cold for months and beginning the slow process of becoming what it was capable of becoming. Eugenia was 93 years old in June, and she planted her gardens at 93. She was slower than she had been the previous year. The right hip had worsened through the cold months and required a cane on difficult days, which she used without particular feeling about it, the cane being another tool that required incorporation into the working routine rather than a defeat to be managed emotionally. She adjusted her pace. She adjusted her schedule, extending the hours she spent in the garden over more days rather than concentrating them. She got the seeds in. Dave and Keisha had arrived in April, a young couple in their 30s, found through a sustainable agriculture network that Fletcher Odom had connected her with in January. They lived in the old tenant cottage at the lower edge of the property that had been empty for years, and they worked with her in the way that she required help to be provided as learners, as much as helpers, bringing their strength and their time, and in exchange for the specific education that came from working alongside someone who had been doing a thing for 57 years and knew where all the knowledge lived. Keisha had the aptitude. Eugenia had recognized it within the first week, the quality of attention, the right questions, the ability to observe without immediately intervening, the patience with small-scale detail that seed saving required. She began teaching Keisha in earnest, not the tasks, but the reasons, not the procedure, but the understanding beneath the procedure, the understanding that would allow her to make the right decision in situations the procedure didn't cover. This was what continuation required, not followers, understanders. Noel came on the second Sunday of every month. The visits had begun in January tentatively with the specific carefulness of someone who was building something they had damaged and was not certain what weight it would bear. By March, they had settled into a rhythm that was less careful and more real. They worked in the garden together on the Sunday visits when the season allowed it. Noelle learned the names of the varieties she had been walking past for decades without learning, learned the generation numbers and what they meant, learned to read the documentation notebooks with the growing comprehension of someone who was discovering a language they had been surrounded by without recognizing as language. They talked on the Sunday visits, not always about important things, sometimes about the grandchildren, about what was happening in Charlotte, about the novel Noelle was reading, or the things she had seen on television that she thought Eugenia would have an opinion about. The ordinary traffic of a relationship between two people who had decided to be in each other's lives rather than at the margins of them. On a Sunday in May, planting beans. They were in the east bed with the Kentucky wonder poles pressing seeds into the soil at the spacing she had used for 54 years, the spacing that produced the yield she needed while allowing the air circulation that reduced disease pressure. Noelle was working the row beside her, following the spacing, placing the seeds with the care she had developed over 6 months of similar work. Noelle straightened up from where she had been kneeling and looked at Eugenia with the expression she had been working toward for 5 months, the expression of a person who has arrived at something they needed to say and has found the moment. "Mom," she said, "I'm sorry for what we tried to do. I know I said it in December. I'm saying it again because December was the courthouse, and I want to say it here where it actually happened." Eugenia paused in her planting and looked at her daughter. The May light was long and warm on the garden, the specific golden afternoon light of a Blue Ridge spring, the light that made everything it touched look briefly like itself at its best. Noelle was kneeling in the dirt with soil on her good jeans and her hands dark from the earth, and her face carrying the expression of someone who had arrived at a true understanding rather than a performed one. "I understand now why you couldn't leave this," Noelle said. "I don't think I'll ever understand it completely the way you understand it. But I see that it matters to you more than safety or comfort or any of the things we thought should come first." She paused. "Your judgment about your own life should have been enough for us." "I'm sorry it wasn't." Eugenia looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she reached across the row between them and put her hand on Noelle's arm briefly, the gesture of a woman for whom physical affection had always been precise rather than extravagant, meaningful because it was measured. "Thank you," she said. They went back to planting. The afternoon moved around them. The beans went into the ground one by one, each one a small act of faith in another season, each one carrying within it the 16 generations of selection that had produced it in the seasons to come that would produce the 17th. The light moved across the garden in the way it always moved, slowly and with the unhurried confidence of a thing that had been doing this for a very long time. In October, State held a formal ceremony. The designation was official. Now Eugenia Whitmore's collection had been formally designated a National Plant Genetic Resource Collection with the protections and preservation funding that the designation carried. There was a plaque. There were people assembled in a room at the university who stood and applauded when she was introduced, which she received with the composed attention of someone who had not done the work for applause and found that its arrival did not substantially alter her relationship to the work. Fletcher Odom spoke about 57 years of systematic work, about the varieties rescued from extinction, about the particular irreplaceable value of things done quietly over a long time without waiting for recognition. He spoke about the distinction between institutional science and the science that sometimes happened outside institutions in the hands of people who had identified an important problem and the right approach to it, and had simply continued decade after decade without the validation of affiliation or funding or the particular authority that came from having a title that matched the work. Eugenia spoke last briefly. "I'm not good at speeches," she said. "I'm better at keeping seeds alive. So let me keep doing what I'm good at, and you can come look at the results every spring if you want to know how it's going." The laughter was warm, the kind that came from genuine recognition rather than social courtesy. Noelle was in the audience. Cody had sent flowers and a card that said something careful and genuine, the card of a man who was taking his time arriving at what he meant and was going to take more time yet, but was moving in the right direction. From Garrett, there was nothing. She had not expected anything. She held no anger about the silence, and she held no grief about it either. What she held was the clear-eyed understanding of a woman who had been accurately observing people for 9 decades and could afford at this point in her life to see what was true without requiring it to be something else. That night alone in the cabin, she had asked for a few minutes before Dave and Keisha drove her home from the ceremony, a few minutes to stand outside in the October dark and let the day settle. The air was the air of the North Carolina mountains in October, cold and clear, and carrying the particular smell of leaf fall, the smell of the season completing itself. She stood in it and thought about Walter. Not the grief of missing him, which was a thing she had learned to live with the way you learn to live with the ache in a joint that would never fully heal. Something different tonight. The specific quality of wanting to show him something. She came home and stood at the kitchen sink for a moment, the plaque under her arm, and looked out the window at the dark garden. Then she went to the seed room. The plaque was standard issue, the kind institutions produce for this kind of occasion, engraved text on a dark background, precise and dignified, and not beautiful in the way that the things in this room were beautiful. She carried it to the wall where she had decided it would go, the wall beside the photograph. Walter in the photograph. Walter at 50, squinting into a summer afternoon sun in the garden, holding up a squash of remarkable size with the expression he wore when something he had been tending had exceeded expectation. That private smile, that private satisfaction, the expression of a man who asked things of living things and was sometimes astonished by what they offered in return. She had been looking at this photograph for 20 years. It had been on this wall for 20 years above the workbench he had built, and among the shelves he had built, and the jars she had filled, and the notebooks she had written, the whole accumulated structure of a life's work that was both hers and his, and somehow always both at once. She hung the plaque on the wall beside the photograph. She stepped back and looked at both. "We did it," she said, not loudly, not with ceremony. The way she said the things that mattered most in the register, she reserved for the truest things, the register that required no volume, because volume was for making yourself heard, and she was speaking to someone who could hear her perfectly well. They said it mattered. It really genuinely mattered. She stood in the seed room with the lamplight warm around her, and the glass jars holding their quiet populations of living things, and the notebooks on their shelves, and the plaque on the wall, and the photograph of the man with the summer squash, and that private smile. Outside, the October dark was full of stars. She had work to do in the morning. The rotation plan for next season was half-drafted on the workbench, and she needed to finish it in December, so the seed orders could go out before the new year. There were varieties that needed to be grown out in the spring, a backlog of one season's worth of missed rotation from the preceding year's uncertainty, and the schedule required careful attention to make room for them without overcrowding the beds that needed the space. She had already been making notes. She knew what the plan was going to look like. Dave and Keisha were learning the system at the pace that understanding required rather than the pace that convenience preferred, which was the right pace, the only pace that produced the kind of knowing she needed them to have. Keisha had correctly identified, without being told, why the Moon and Stars watermelons needed to be planted at the far northern end of the property rather than in the main garden beds, had arrived at the answer through her own observation of the air circulation patterns over 2 seasons of paying attention. That was the kind of knowing. That was what would carry the work past the limits of her own seasons. Noelle's youngest daughter had asked at 12 years old if she could come help in the garden next summer. Eugenia had said yes without hesitation because 12 was not too early, and in some respects was already late, and the work of teaching understanding was long. The collection would not end with her. She had understood this in the abstract for years, had worked toward it deliberately, had built a structure for continuation with the same intention she had brought to building every other part of the work. But understanding it in the abstract was different from standing in the seed room with the plaque on the wall and Keisha in the cottage down the hill, with 3 seasons of learning already in her hands and Noelle's daughter asking to come in summer. The difference was what had allowed her in the past months to sleep more deeply than she had slept since Walter died. The work was larger than her now. It was held by the world, rather than by her, alone held by the records she had made and the institution that had designated it significant in the people who were learning its logic and the understanding that was being transferred from her hands and her years of attention into the hands and years of people who would be here long after she was not. She could rest in that, not stop. She was not going to stop. She had varieties to grow and selections to make and notebooks to continue and a rotation plan to complete before December. but rest in the sense of a person who has been carrying sole responsibility for a long time and has finally distributed the weight into a structure that can hold it beyond any single person's strength. She turned off the lamp. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and stood at the window while the water heated, looking out at the October night, the familiar shapes of the dark garden under the stars. The percolator was on the shelf where it had been since 1975. The robe was on the hook by the bed. The notebooks were in the seed room on the shelves that Walter had built to hold 100 years of work. The kettle began its quiet sound. She thought about the morning which would begin, as all mornings began, with the inventory and the fire and the coffee and the window and the work waiting to be done. She thought about March and the starting trays in the east corner of the seed room and the Cherokee purple tomatoes going into them as the 16th generation, the ordinary, extraordinary act of another beginning. She thought about what Walter had said in the garden in the summer of 1968, standing with juice on his chin in the last of the afternoon light. Future generations need these. He had meant the seeds. He had also meant more than the seeds, though he had not known it yet, and neither had she. He had meant the knowledge, the habit of attention, the understanding that the things worth preserving required the ongoing presence of someone willing to preserve them not once, but season after season, not in storage, but in living continuation, not as a record of what had been, but as an active part of what was. That was what they had built here. That was what she had kept alive for 20 years after he was gone, in the cabin he had made from this mountain's timber in the room on whose shelves his work and hers had become indistinguishable from each other. That was what was going to continue. She made her tea, and she sat at the kitchen table and she drank it in the quiet of the October night, and the wood stove ticked and settled in the way it had ticked and settled for 43 years, and the seeds rested in their jars on their shelves through the wall, patient in the way of living things that understood they were waiting for spring. And Eugenia Whitmore sat in the warmth of everything she had built, intended, and refused to surrender. And she was in the only sense that had ever mattered to her exactly where she was supposed to be.